1 hour later, everyone met back in the living room. Walter and Anwen had prepared 4 mountain packs. Courtney and Margo had repaired the surface damage to the outside of the house. Any further repairs would have to wait. At least the repairs they had managed wouldn't invite any unwanted guests. When Tyler emerged from the spare bedroom, he looked almost resigned.
I've decided where we're going,
he announced.
It took some convincing of my closest kin, but they all agree it's the best place. And all are welcome.
He didn't mention how his brother had almost opposed the idea. Letting 3 more mortals set foot on sacred soil was not high on his priority list.
So where are we going?
Courtney asked. Tyler smiled with weariness. It had been a trying negotiation.
Back up the mountains. We make for Lake Wyvern in the Sacred Isle.
Anwen's eyes went almost as wide as the others did.
To the Sacred Grove? Are you kidding?
Thoughts of a circular altar inside the shrine filled Anwen's thoughts, along with the memory of sustaining a concussion there. It was something she definitely didn't want to repeat. Shaking his head, Tyler moved to pick up one of the packs.
No, not that far in. As part of the conditions of using the island, no one is allowed to pass the bounding circle. To do so, without permission, means immediate death. And we really can't afford that to happen.
Walter looked after Tyler with misgivings.
Sounds, daunting.
He doubted the dragon was joking. It wasn't in his nature to joke about such things.
But that's right under the mountain.
Courtney protested.
That's where the circle is gathered. Doesn't that make it even more dangerous?
The Fallen cannot go there,
Tyler stated.
It has long been said that the lake water has special properties. It destroys any unclean thing that touches it. Remember what happened when one fell into the water? And should they try to fly over it, well, let's just say they would not get far.
Margo pursed her lips.
Then, let's hope everyone in our group is clean, with pure intentions.
Courtney glanced over at Anwen. Out of the entire party, she and Tyler were the only ones to taste the waters of that lake. And yet, Anwen was still living. Was it because she carried no ill intent? Or was it because Tyler refused to let her die? Or because they had not been tainted by evil?
Time's wasted.
Walter picked up his pack, following Tyler out the door.
Best be off before anything else happens.
Margo and Anwen grabbed a pack and followed him outside. Courtney wasn't too far behind. Tyler had already put his pack in the back of Walter's truck and was waiting to help the others do the same. Holding his hands out for the keys, Tyler resisted the urge to ask Walter to stay. Kern had only allowed this man's inclusion because of his history with Tyler.
I think I should drive,
he said instead.
No one knows the area like I do.
Walter raised a brow as he took the keys out of his pocket.
Are you sure about that? I know how you drive.
He gave him a knowing look, laced with a hint of humor. Tyler rolled his eyes.
The last time you were in a vehicle I drove was back in the desert. And we were threatened by another sandstorm at the time, as I recall. You were still recovering from exposure. I had to use whatever means available to make sure you stayed alive. Sorry if that makes me a bad driver in your eyes. Just remember, I've been doing this a lot longer than you have.
Smiling in amusement, Walter tossed the keys to Tyler.
Well, just make sure you all buckle up,
he advised the ladies.
Tyler loves off-roading.
Taking Walter's joke aside, everyone made sure seatbelts were fastened before starting out. It never hurt to be cautious. Streaks of color began to fill the sky as the sun began its long journey back to the other side of the world. Their party was a good ways away from the city limits by the time it had dropped behind the higher peaks. Tyler followed the same route the bus had used back when Anwen first set foot in the Draconii Mountains. They climbed steadily for hours. Both Courtney and Anwen dozed in the back, even though it was cramped with their gear. About 15 miles outside the village of Lindworm, Tyler pulled off the main road. There was a small track off to one side that was hard to see from the main highway. It had once been used as a fire road in case of natural disasters. Due to the lack of such disasters, it had fallen into disuse. Ultimately, it had been left to the mountains to reclaim. Anwen woke with a jolt as the vehicle bounced over a fallen branch. She tried to peer out the windows but only saw a mass of black flashing by. Dark trees lined the little-used path, and with the moon not yet rising, everything was dark except where the headlights shone. Yawning, Anwen tried to guess at the time. She supposed it was still before midnight but wasn't sure. She'd been rather tired, even with the recent rest she'd received. though she supposed she shouldn't be surprised. The adrenaline rush from the fallen attack had given her more than ample reason to crash.
The path's a little more rugged than I remember.
Tyler confessed as they hit another bump.
We should almost be to an old ranger station where we'll leave the truck. From there, we'll hike the rest of the way to the lake.
Margo tried to calculate where they were based off her own memories and the maps she'd studied. She figured they were off to the right of the highway, though she wasn't exactly sure where.
Just how long of a jaunt are we talking about?
She asked. She glanced back at her daughter, realizing she was awake. Tyler didn't so much as look away from the road as he thought about it. He kept the vehicle going at a steady rate. Despite the conditions, the trees went by at a rapid speed.
I'd have to estimate an hour or two.
He finally replied.
After that, it will take some time to cross the lake. Regardless of the actual time involved, we must reach the island before daybreak. We can't let the mage circle know we're here. And until we're on that island, we won't be safe.
Oh, goodness. I knew I shouldn't have taken that nap.
Walter groaned. Having been up since the small hours of the morning, he was starting to feel the weariness set in. Realizing this, Tyler smiled in compassion, even though he knew his friend couldn't see it.
Once we arrive on the island, we can rest as much as needed. We should be free from prying eyes as long as we're under the cover of the trees.
Half an hour later, Tyler stopped the truck, parking in a small clearing. Half a dozen logs formed a semicircle where someone had packed the earth solid. A dilapidated wooden building stood off to one side. The door had fallen in and vines reached out from the windows. Overhead, stars filled the sky as Tyler killed the engine. The sound of insects and nocturnal creatures rushed in to fill the silence. Anwen nudged Courtney, trying to wake her.
Hey, we're here.
She whispered. She knew they were miles away from the village, or the mountain. Despite that, she somehow felt if she talked any louder, the mage circle would hear her. Courtney groaned, but opened her eyes. She had to blink a few times to adjust to the near black darkness surrounding them. After a minute or so, her eyes had adjusted to the starlight.
Doesn't look like the lake to me.
She complained. Tyler left the truck's cabin and walked around to the back, retrieving his pack.
We have a long hike ahead of us.
He said in reply to Courtney's sleepy observations.
And then a bit of a ride over water. Nothing to it.
Courtney rolled her eyes as she stiffly got out of the truck.
Easy for you to say. You have the stamina of the undead.
Anwen felt tempted to laugh, but didn't as she accepted her pack. It suddenly seemed so much heavier now that she had to carry it for several long miles.
I wish we could just fly there.
She sighed.
And alert the entire mountain to our presence?
Margo asked.
I wouldn't even harbor the possibility, even if Tyler offered it.
I know.
Anwen stared at the ground. She thought she heard the distant sound of laughter. It sounded like Daphne.
Leave me alone.
She hissed at the ground. Courtney gave her friend a rather odd look. Not sure why she'd earned that comment. She was about to say something when the other girl spoke up again.
Not you.
Anwen amended, hoping Courtney wasn't offended.
Just a little insect trying to make me mad.
With everyone ready to go, Tyler led the way. He summoned a small light orb. He then masked it enough so the light wouldn't alert anyone to their presence. He nodded in satisfaction at the wards Courtney and Margo had created before heading out. They should keep them from being detected. He added an extra layer from his added wards. Even the most skilled member of the circle would have a hard time discerning their presence. Unfortunately, the path was not as direct a route as some of the party had hoped. To be extra sure they were not discovered, Tyler took them on a more roundabout direction. That meant he sometimes backtracked. After several hours of this, he finally let them rest for more than a few minutes. During this time, they broke out small rations.
Aren't we there yet?
Courtney complained. She inspected a long scratch that ran down her exposed arm. She wished they'd had time to at least go to a store and get more clothing. The branches were murder on her skin. As things were, she only had the sets they'd brought from the village, and those were starting to get ragged, even with some minor repairs. Anwen looked around, noticing a slight change in the lightness of the sky. The air was also cooler.
Looks like the sun might be rising soon.
She said. Inside her head, Daphne laughed. Tyler looked towards the sky. What Anwen had said was true. It was still in the early hours of the morning, but the sun would start to ascend the mountainside before long. Time was indeed running out.
We're almost there.
He assured as he recapped his canteen.
Let's go.
Picking their way through fallen foliage, Tyler led them once more. The air began to grow more damp the closer they came to the lake. Within another half hour, they had reached the shore, but there was no visible way of crossing the large span between the bank and the island, unless they swam. Walter shaded his eyes with one hand as he looked out towards the far shore. It wasn't to keep off any light, but as a sort of makeshift binoculars.
I knew I should have packed that inflatable raft.
He joked with a low whistle.
That's a bit away, isn't it?
Margo stared impassively towards the east. The faintest hints of color were beginning to show between the mountain peaks.
I hope you have something in mind for this situation.
She commented as she turned to Tyler.
Otherwise, we won't make it in time. Unless you want to transform into your true form and fly us over. Not that I'm recommending it.
The dragon ignored her dry words. Instead, he continued the work he'd started upon reaching the shore. While the others had admired the view, he'd been busy hauling over several fallen logs. Seeing his efforts, Walter joined him. Soon they both had gathered a good collection of odd-sized branches and drift. Finding some vines, Tyler quickly laced them over the wooden limbs. With that finished, he placed one hand on the rickety raft they'd created. Closing his eyes, he concentrated on the form.
Hate to break it to you, mate.
Walter interposed.
That won't hold us all, even if it will float.
Tyler either ignored him or didn't hear. For a moment it seemed as though light had flown from him into the dead wood as he closed his eyes. The gnarled branches began to change, smoothing out. With a few more minutes' worth of coaxing, the wood flattened out. The ends bowed together to create a stern and prow. The widening surface curled up to make a watertight vessel. Finished, Tyler opened his eyes, pleased with his efforts. A thin but durable boat bobbed lightly on the lake's edge. It was more than large enough to accommodate the 5 travelers and their gear.
You were saying?
He turned to look questioningly at Walter. Courtney clapped her hands in anticipation.
Now all we need is a pair or two of oars.
She looked around for several sturdy branches of a smaller size. She found 2. Using a similar spell to Tyler's, she coaxed the wood to change according to their needs. When she was done, she noticed Margo had done the same. Under Tyler's direction, Walter and Anwen stored the packs in the middle of the boat. They used one of the ropes Walter had packed to secure them in place. By the time they'd finished, both Margo and Courtney had completed their tasks. After everyone had climbed aboard and situated themselves, Tyler pushed off from the shore. Margo sat with Courtney in the front, Tyler paired with Walter in the back, each with a paddle. Anwen sat in the middle, as far from the sides as possible. Tyler didn't want to risk retesting her lack of swimming skills. Even with Tyler's reassurances, Anwen felt ill at ease. The last time she'd been on the lake's waters had not been a good experience. She still remembered the feel of the water pushing her down. It was not something she wanted to repeat, even if she'd had visions of dragons while under the surface. Paddles dipped quietly but strongly in the water. With 2 sets of rowers, their makeshift boat seemed to move more like a swift current carried it. By the time the morning light began to climb down the mountain's side, they were halfway to the island. Maybe it had something to do with Tyler's mental request to the lake waters for swift passage. Maybe it was because they had more help than the last time he and Anwen had been on the lake. Either way, Anwen was glad. Tyler directed the boat towards the far side of the island, away from the prying eyes on the mountain. A second, smaller jetty sat near where the tail would have jutted out from the rear of the island's main body. Several smaller islands moved away, as though the tail was only partially submerged. If the water's level had been lower, they'd have all connected. Instead, a small beach waited where the spur flowed downward. Both Tyler and Walter jumped out to guide the boat up onto the shore, landing them several dozen yards away from the jetty they'd seen earlier. Safely secured, they helped the others out as the sun's light hit the lake.
Just in time.
Tyler noted as he looked out over the water.
Up and in now.
Trees lined the shore, making it easy to conceal the boat. Keeping to Tyler's words, they moved further in. Maybe half a mile up the slope, Tyler called a halt.
We'll make camp here,
he announced. Walter looked around the green foliage.
Not bad,
he said in approval. They stood in a small clearing. A stream ran nearby, providing ample water, and with plenty of dead wood to make a fire, it made an ideal camping site. After another hour, the small group had 2 tents set up. Walter collected stones to create a decent-sized fire pit. Courtney went to collect the first batch of firewood. Anwen found a stone to use as a seat near the tent she was to share with Courtney and her mother. She felt strange setting foot back on the sacred island. It was as though static electricity lined her body. She almost felt afraid to touch anything because of the possibility of static shock. Having finished unpacking her gear, Margo walked over to her daughter.
training begins now. You will do exactly as I say, when I say it. Is that clear?
Anwen looked up at her mother's serious tone. She was still tired from the ordeal the day before, not to mention their most recent hike. All she wanted to do was crawl inside the tent and sleep. That or to find some food. She hadn't eaten in days. No one had thought to offer a snack on the way over, and she'd not felt hungry enough to ask for one. But she knew her mother all too well.
Now?
She looked up with wistful eyes, already knowing the answer. Margo raised her eyebrows a bit, hands on her hips as she gave her that no-nonsense look.
Now.
With a sigh, Anwen stood and followed her mother.
What kind of training?
She wondered out loud, hoping she'd at least get the chance to eat something first. Margo picked up a canteen on the way out of camp.
You'll see,
She promised. Not wanting to go too far, Margo kept careful watch on her directions. After half an hour of easy walking, they came across a little glen with another small stream.
This will do.
She commented to herself. She thrust the canteen at her daughter.
You'll need this.
She explained.
Your first task is to sit and listen.
Anwen looked at her in disbelief.
You want me to just sit here and listen? For how long? And what am I listening for?
Margo's eyes looked like a stormy sky.
Until you can hear everything. A mage understands her surroundings and heeds them. Being in tune with nature is the first step. No nodding off.
With that, she turned and walked away. Anwen stared after her, the canteen dangling from her fingers.
You're serious? I have to sit here and just listen?
Until you hear everything.
Her mother reminded as she disappeared into the foliage. Anwen wasn't sure what she meant by that, but decided it was best to do as her mother ordered. So she found a relatively comfortable spot and sat down to meditate. It was hard, especially since all she really wanted to do was go to sleep.